What's up, everybody? My name is Joe Brown, and this is Heresy Financial. Recently, I saw a tweet by the self-proclaimed fiat shill Joe Weisenthal talking about how really there is no difference whatsoever between the Federal Reserve creating new reserves, what we call money printing, and a government or a corporation creating a bond out of thin air by borrowing money. And it caught my attention because it really highlights the clever deception that is just intertwined into modern economics today. So in this video, we are going to break down what the truths are in this, because there are some kernels of truth that make this so believable and seem so logical and correct. We're also going to break it down to show why the overall message this is sending is completely false. And we're going to do all of this in just 3 simple steps. Just kidding, George. I only need 1. Ready? Let's dive in. First things first, just a little bit of background here. Number 1, I'm very active on Twitter, and if you're not already, you can follow me at Heresy Financial. One thing I like to use Twitter for is to follow people and listen to ideas that I disagree with. I think that's very important, whether I'm on Twitter or books or podcasts, whatever. I like to listen to ideas that I think are incorrect. And this is especially important with investing, because if you believe reality is one way and you're going to invest according to that, but reality is actually a different way, that could lead you to losing lots of money. And if I put myself in an echo chamber and I never test my beliefs and I never try and prove myself wrong by listening to the best arguments of things that I disagree with, then there's no way for me to be able to potentially change my mind. And if I'm wrong about something, again, especially with investing, that can hurt me in the long run. I'd much rather be profitable than right. And there's probably no better example of somebody that I disagree with more than Joe Weisenthal, self-proclaimed fiat shill, editor at Bloomberg. So let's break down what he said. When any entity, a government or a company, sells a bond, the bond didn't exist until it was sold. The bond was created out of thin air, and yet when the Fed creates reserves out of thin air, somehow that's seen as some kind of scandalous money printing. But it's the same thing. Okay, first sentence, let's look at that. When any entity, a government or a company, sells a bond, the bond didn't exist until it was sold. The bond was created out of thin air. Is that true or untrue? Yes, it is true. And this is why I call this cleverly deceptive, because the bond itself being created out of thin air, let's look at just corporate bonds at first, is completely meaningless, because the bond is just an instrument, a contract that represents what? It represents debt. So what is debt? It is resources or money being owed from one party to another because they have borrowed it. So I borrow $1,000 from you, and there's a contract that states I have to give that $1,000 back. That is a bond. So of course, that contract itself was created out of thin air, but were the resources created out of thin air? Or specifically, was that money created out of thin air? Absolutely not. That purchasing power was created or was acquired through labor, through time, through investing, through savings. It wasn't created out of thin air. That $1,000 was your $1,000 that you earned and saved, and you transferred that to me, and I have to give that back. So the contract itself, which is the bond that represents I have to pay something back to you, was created out of thin air. But the money was not. The money was an investment. It was a loan that came from savings, and that savings was a result of labor. Okay, let's move on. And yet when the Fed creates reserves out of thin air, somehow that's seen as some kind of scandalous money printing, but it's the same thing. So is this the same thing? Well, in some circumstances, yes, and in some circumstances, no. And I'll explain why. What we have to do now is circle back to the first part where he talks about a bond. And in this case, we're going to look at the federal government. When the federal government wants to spend money, they can only get that money from 2 sources. They can either tax it or they can borrow it. That is the only source of income for a government. We all understand taxes, right? You get your paycheck, you've made $100,000 this year, and $50,000 of it went to Uncle Sam. That's taxes. That's easy to understand, that's straightforward. But because it's easy to understand, that pain is readily available. So the government doesn't like to use taxes to fund all of its spending. So it relies on the other method to do its spending, to increase its income for its spending, which is borrowing. Now we have to look look at borrowing closely because there are two different types of borrowing that are going on here. The first is borrowing from citizens or companies through the use of treasuries. Now, this is your great Aunt Sally who wants a safe return, somewhere safe to put her cash, so she buys a treasury, which is saying, okay, I'm going to give the federal government $1,000 and they're going to pay me 1.28% interest every year for the next 10 years. And then at the end of that 10 years, I get my money back and I trust them because they can always get more money if they need to because they've got a military, they've got the IRS that can seize people's bank accounts and garnish wages and raise taxes on people if they need to pay back the money that they owe. Because no government that issues debt in its own currency has ever defaulted on its debt before, right? Okay, so that's the first kind of borrowing, when the federal government extracts resources out of the economy by people or institutions voluntarily diverting their money to the governments for a safe, steady source of income, a place to hold their money as kind of like savings until they want to do something else with it. And so it's extracting resources from certain areas of the economy that are voluntarily given to the government in exchange for the interest that they're going to get paid along the way. So both of these, taxes and borrowing, are both taking money out of certain areas of the economy, then the government spends that, which is just putting the money back into different areas of the economy, like the paychecks of politicians. But this isn't the only type of borrowing that's going on. Because if this was the only type of borrowing going on, it would be just like a corporation that we described earlier. When the government borrows money from you, that's money that came from savings, right? It's not being created out of thin air. It's redistribution of money, really is what it is. It's money coming from one area and going to another. Just like when you loan $1,000 to me, that money goes from you to me, I use it, and then at some point I have to give that back. There's no growth in the money supply here. But there's a second type of borrowing that's going on here. This is when the federal government is able to borrow money from an entity that can print an infinite amount of money. This is the government borrowing from the Federal Reserve. Now, when this happens, pay attention to how different this is than taxes or borrowing from economic actors. This is not your great Aunt Sally giving up her $1,000 to the government for 10 years so that in the meantime they can use that $1,000 to build a bridge here or bomb one in the Middle East. This is the government coming to the end of the economic road and saying, does anybody else want to lend to us at these current rates? The entire economy saying no, not at these current rates. So somebody else who has a legal monopoly on the creation of money saying, we want some of that debt, we'll just create as much money as you need and lend that to you. That is the relationship between the Federal Reserve and the government. Now here's the problem. Because that relationship would be too transparent and people would not be happy about that, that relationship is actually technically illegal. The Federal Reserve is not allowed to directly lend money to the government. And so what happens instead is the banks lend that money to the government, and then once that bond is created out of thin air, the banks turn around and sell that contract to the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve prints up a bunch of new money, credits that to the bank's accounts at the Federal Reserve. That's what bank reserves are, and now the bank has new cash that they can turn around and do something else with, and guess what they do with it? They go back to the federal government and loan that new money to the federal government again. So the financial system, banks, they basically operate as a middleman between the federal government and the Federal Reserve to allow money printing to directly fund the borrowing of the United States government past the capacity of the economy to support. And keep in mind, borrowing itself is only there because the federal government has already tapped out the economy on taxes. So first they tax the economy to the point of capacity, then they borrow from the economy to the point of capacity, and then they have to use the banks as the intermediary, but they rely on the money printer, the entity that they gave a legal monopoly on money creation to fund the rest of their spending needs. And so back to the tweet, the last sentence, but it's the same thing. When an entity like the US government sells a bond, which is borrowing, when they borrow money, and the Federal Reserve creates reserves out of thin air, it's the same thing. And guess what? In this case, it's the same thing. And that's the best part about this, is that the federal government spends money into existence. And most people blame the Fed for the money printing and the inflation, but really what's going on here is the Federal Reserve is the one behind or funding or enabling the federal government to spend that money into existence. If you had the Federal Reserve all off by itself and those newly created reserves couldn't make their way into the expenses, into the outlays of the federal government, you wouldn't have the inflation that we have right now. You wouldn't have the monetary expansion. And the fact of the matter is that the Federal Reserve is a creation of Congress and sits under the rules and under the laws and exists solely by the allowance of Congress. Is this system convoluted? 100%. And it's done that way intentionally so that 99.9% of people cannot understand how new money comes into existence, where it comes from, and why we have the economic problems that we have today. And to rub salt in the wound, people like this make statements like this that are basically true. It is true, and they're praising it. They're saying this is a good thing. So I'm all for the shade that's being thrown at Powell, that's being thrown at the Federal Reserve for their monetary policy that has caused the escalation of economic problems that we've seen over the last couple of decades. But I'd really like to see some responsibility laid on the shoulders of the people in Congress who continually allow and encourage its existence, allow it to step outside its legal boundaries by letting it go through these loopholes to continue to fund the madness and let the government spend money into existence at the crazy pace that it has done so and looks like it will continue to do so in the future. And my only fear is that if we ever do see an end to the Fed, it will be as a result of the Federal Reserve being swallowed up and folded into the Treasury so that Congress has a direct control over the money printer. And I really hope that never happens. As always, I really appreciate you guys. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.